Okay, now let's do some factoring trinomials. And I hope you're up on your FOIL method. That's why I had you practice this. So factoring, the kind of thing we're doing here, is like FOIL in reverse. Instead of starting with two separate binomials and multiplying them together to see what we end up with, we're starting with the kind of thing you end up with when you do the FOIL method and trying to split it back apart into those two separate binomials. So the goal, you can think of these as little puzzles that you're trying to solve. The solution to the puzzle is two separate factors that when you FOIL them together give you this thing that we're looking at right here. So what can we multiply together to get x squared plus 14x plus 45? They have to start with x. We need x times x to get x squared for the f part of FOIL. And for the L part of FOIL, the last part of each binomial, those have to multiply together to give us the number on the end, 45. So, and then the outside and the inside are going to combine to give us 14x. So we need numbers that multiply to 45, and then they have to add up to 14. So there are a few possibilities for numbers that multiply to 45. There's 9 times 5. There's 15 times 3. There's 45 times 1. But out of those possibilities, the way to get numbers that also add up to 14 would be to have a 9 and a 5. And it doesn't matter which one you put where. If I had written x plus 5 times x plus 9, that's essentially the same thing. So if we multiply this out, x squared plus 5x plus 9x, which combines to give you 14x, plus 45. So you should always be able to tell whether you have the right answer or not by multiplying it back out and making sure that what you get is the trinomial you started with. Let's try this one. How can we factor x squared plus 13x plus 22 into something times something? They both have to start with x, so that x times x gives us x squared. And they have to end with numbers that multiply to 22. So think what times what could give you 22. And then those numbers have to add up to 13. 11 and 2. So x plus 11 times x plus 2. What about this one? X squared minus 18x plus 17. Now this time, it has to start with x times x, and it has to end with numbers that multiply to 17. Now keep in mind that when you have two numbers multiplied together and they come out positive, one way that can happen is if both of the numbers are positive, but another way that can happen is when you have a negative times a negative. So since we want our numbers to add up to negative 18, we want the outside and the inside part of FOIL to combine to minus 18x, these had both better be negative. So can you think of two negative numbers that you can multiply together to get 17? Well, pretty much the only choice is a 17 and a 1. So x minus 17 times x minus 1. If you FOIL that out, you get x squared minus 1x minus 17x, so there's minus 18x plus 17. How about this one? X squared minus 2x minus 35. This time, the number on the end is a negative number. And if you want to multiply two things together and have the answer come out negative, one of those things has to be positive and the other one has to be negative. So one of these has a plus, one has a minus. And then what numbers do multiply to give you a 35 kind of a thing? Well, like a 7 times a 5. And one of them has to be plus and one of them has to be minus. And they have to add up to the minus 2 in front of the x in the middle. So how about this? What if we put a 7 here and a 5 here? Let's check that. X squared, outside we got minus 5x. Inside we got plus 7x. When you add those together, they add up to plus 2x. Uh-oh, that's not quite right. A positive 7 and a negative 5 would add up to a positive 2. Well, what if we switch those around? Make it so that the plus is on the 5 and the minus is on the 7. Now we get x squared minus 7x plus 5x. So there's your minus 2x minus 35. Okay, that one works. We're good to go. Try this one. 5x squared plus 15x minus 20. Start by pulling out the greatest common factor. This one has, does it look familiar? It's that one that we looked at the beginning of the last video when we were talking about greatest common factor. We saw you could pull out a 5, and I said that maybe there was something else we could do. So is there? Can we take this x squared plus 3x minus 4 and do something else with that? Well, let's see. They would both have to start with x. So this x times this x gives you x squared. And they would have to end with numbers that multiply to negative 4. So one of them's positive and one of them's negative. And could be a 4 and a 4. A 4 and a 1. Could be 2 and a 2. But they have to add up to positive 3. So how about a plus 4 and a minus 1? So once this is factored completely, we have 5 times x plus 4 times x minus 1. X squared minus x minus 42. X minus 7 times x plus 6. Remember, the numbers have to multiply to negative 42, and they have to add up to, well, negative 1. A plus 6x and a minus 7x combined to just minus x. Oh, now here we get a new twist. This starts with not just x squared, but 7x squared. So that makes things a little tricky. We're still going to pull this apart into two factors. But instead of both factors starting with x, one of them has to start with 7x. Because when we do the f part of FOIL, the first things have to multiply together to 7x squared. So the way to get that to happen is to have a 7x times an x. Now the numbers on the end, the L part of FOIL, these last terms have to multiply together to give you 3. So I think that pretty much has to be a 3 times a 1, or a 1 times a 3. But it does matter which one we put where. If I do it like this, if I put a 1 here and a 3 here, that does give us the right L. But what about the O and the I? Outside, we have 7x times 3, that's 21x. Inside, we have 1 times x, and those combine to 22x, which is not what we wanted. What if we switch them around? What if we put the 3 here and the 1 here? Now if we FOIL this sucker, we get 7x squared plus 7x plus 3x, which combines to give you, yay, 10x plus 3. So yes, there's the correct factoring. Okay, what about this one? 9x squared plus 17x minus 2. How can we break that up into two binomials that FOIL together to give us that? Well, they would have to start with, there's actually two possibilities here, two ways of getting a 9x squared. Could be a 9x times an x, could be a 3x times a 3x. Which one is it? Well, we'll just have to figure out what works with all the other stuff we're trying to figure out. The numbers that go on the end have to multiply together to give you 2, or to give you negative 2. So one's a plus, one's a minus, one's a 2, one's a 1. That's pretty much your only possibilities. But what can we put where so that when we do the outside and the inside and combine them, they add up to plus 17x? Might take you a little trial and error. If you want to pause the video and see if you can figure this out, you can do that. Turns out that what works is to have 9x minus 1 times x plus 2. So put a minus 1 on the inside, a plus 2 on the outside, and when you FOIL that, you get 9x squared plus 18x minus 1x, so there's your plus 17x, minus 2. There is an alternative method that some people like to use to do this kind of factoring. It's something called, well, some books at least call it the AC method. And the way it works is this: to factor a trinomial of the form ax squared plus bx plus c. First find AC, that is, multiply together the coefficient on the x squared times the constant term. Now, look for two numbers that multiply to give you that, the number you got for AC, and that add to give you the number in the middle, in the place of b. Then use those two numbers that you just found to break up that middle term into two separate x terms that add up to bx. And then take what you have here, these four terms, and factor by grouping. So here's how that would work. If we're using the AC method, a times c would be 9 times negative 2, which would be negative 18. So we need to look for numbers that multiply to negative 18 and add to positive 17. Can you think what that would be? What two numbers multiply up to negative 18? That means one of them has to be positive and one has to be negative, and add to positive 17. Okay, those numbers would be an 18 and a negative 1. A positive 18 and a negative 1. So I can take this plus 17x and write it as plus 18x minus 1x. I use the positive 18 and the negative 1 to break up that middle term. Now I'm going to factor by grouping. Remember, you group the first two terms together and pull out their biggest common factor, which would be 9x. This is a 9x times an x. This is a 9x times a 2. So that's 9x times x plus 2. And the last two terms, all I can pull out from those is a minus 1. So negative 1 times x plus 2. Once you've pulled out the minus, it's a plus here. And now this and this have a common factor of x plus 2, so we can factor that out, and the other factor has the 9x minus the 1. So same thing we got when we did it sort of by trial and error, by figuring out what had to go where to FOIL up to this. 9x minus 1 times x plus 2. Okay, this video is getting a little long, so I'm going to end this one here and come back in another with just some more examples so you really get the hang of this and do some more factoring examples.